It's time for another episode of the Global Meditation Podcast. This weekly show features explorations of spiritual and paranormal topics with a focus on bridging the physical and metaphysical, bringing deeper meaning to our individual and collective lives. And now here's your host, Darby Miller.
Hello, welcome to the Global Meditation Podcast. My name is Darby Miller. You're about to listen to episode 6 of season 2. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with a fellow remote viewer named Jeff Bogusz. Jeff has a fascinating story to tell, which includes the apparent activation of latent psychic abilities after a lightning strike and the healing of a pituitary tumor with visualization exercises that were inspired by his uncle's own healing journey and the visitation of a helping spirit, which was also involved in this healing. I think you're going to find Jeff's story very interesting, and we'll get right to it after I read Jeff's bio. Jeff says he has a hard time writing a bio because he doesn't like to be defined, and I can certainly relate to that. He has extensive experience in his primary field of confectionery research and development, but shuns the sort of titles that an HR department would apply. He prefers the simple title of candy maker. The descriptor he does like is mismatcher, someone who looks at the differences in the world and seeks out the differences that make a difference. Associated with this, Jeff has cultivated soft beliefs. You'll hear Jeff talk about soft beliefs in the podcast. At one extreme, soft beliefs are accepting things that you don't understand in cases where they work for you. At the other extreme, it's being flexible with things you hold absolutely true, just enough to also allow for other possibilities. As part of a discussion of Jeff's healing experiences, he mentions 2 books, and after we recorded the podcast, he asked me to mention one more book. The anatomy coloring book is often an early part of medical school education. By coloring pictures of human anatomy associated with the disease, patients can gain new insights into how to heal, and both adults and children seem to enjoy this activity. So with that, we'll go ahead and transition to the recorded interview, and I hope you enjoy it. So Jeff, welcome to the podcast. I've met you very recently as part of a remote viewing group that you and I both started to be involved in, and we had a remote viewing project that we got together just over Zoom, just like we are now. And we hadn't personally met, so we started kind of sharing a little bit more about ourselves. And when you started sharing a little bit about yourself and some of the experiences you have had in your life and some of the experiences some of your family members have had, I thought, wow, I would really love to have you on the podcast, because I think some of the things that you've been through, some of the things your uncle has been through, would really be interesting to a lot of audience members of my podcast, might inspire them to apply some of the ideas to their life. So I'm so glad that you made it on and we can have this conversation. You covered a lot of ground when we were talking just one-on-one before. I suppose maybe the best place to start is maybe you just could give a little bit of background about yourself, maybe some of your professional background, if you want to share that, or anything you deem pertinent.
Youngest of 7 children, grew up in a big family, had some interesting experiences as a child that basically was what today would have been diagnosed as a severe concussion or traumatic brain injury that, looking back at it, I essentially have no memories of 5th and 6th grade. And in 5th and 6th grade, you might have learned some interpersonal skills and things of that nature that allow you to talk normally to other people. And I sort of missed that. So I stand out as somebody who's a little bit different, in some ways, maybe a little bit autistic, although I don't think that's definitely a full definition in any way, shape, or form. But I have a different perspective on life, perhaps because I missed a little bit early on, and I've made up for it in different ways.
So there was an actual accident that happened in 5th grade, something like that, that resulted in a concussion, or?
I'm the poster child for why children should wear helmets on bicycles, yes.
Okay.
I don't know that we need to get into this in great detail there, but I think there's a better story that happened later on.
Mm-hmm.
And so then throughout life became an engineer, was very analytical based, have had a career for 32 years in the confectionery industry. So basically making candy on a very large scale.
Mm-hmm.
And have had a very boring life populated with some very intense and special occasions, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. And what had you, you, as I understand it, you've recently started formally studying remote viewing. As I said, you're part of a group that you and I are both involved in. How did you get what inspired you to start studying remote viewing?
I would say going back and listening to Art Bell back in the day and hearing remote viewers, that was always something that was of interest. So that had always been sort of hanging out there. And I would also say that I always had some sort of, I'm not sure that psychic ability would be the right word, but I don't know how else to define it.
Mm-hmm. You've had some sort of unusual or paranormal type experiences in your life, that some of which you've told me about. They're definitely unusual.
Correct. And one of the things that I had an ability to do was help people find lost objects.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost as though I could see where they left them. I could go back in their history and see where they left their keys or something like that. So I literally had a sister-in-law who would call me often and say, I can't find this, I can't find that. And I would tell her where it was. So there were things like that that sort of evolved over time. And there was an incident where one of the things that whatever I did, whatever it was, if I had an object that was paired to whatever the object that was lost, it seemed like I could find it better. It's like they had a past history that I could somehow follow where they had separated.
They were connected somehow.
Yes. And at one point in time, there was someone who was newly married who asked me, could you help find my husband's wedding ring? And I said, okay, well, the way this typically has worked for me is if I hold on to something that's similar to it, I can help locate it quicker. So I literally took this very innocent woman's hand and held on to her wedding ring. So I'm holding her hand, I'm holding the wedding ring, and I get this imagery of the woman that her husband is sleeping with holding his ring hostage. And it's like, I can't tell this woman this story. I'm just holding her hand. And at this point, I basically just kind of cut it off there and said, yeah, I don't get anything. And I had a very sleepless night. And I literally said, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to shut this off.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, I want to take a little break here and talk about, I have two things that I want to talk about.
Sure.
And the first thing is truth changes. Those two words. And that has a lot of different meanings. So if I were to say I'm 17 years old, that's not truthful today, but at one point in time it was. So what's true does change.
Mm-hmm.
The other big extreme of that would be, a good example would be the Me Too movement. So by speaking the women speaking their truth as to what had happened to them, encouraging other people to speak, that changed the world.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking your truth changes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of different nuances to that. And so I just wanted to say that as I'm telling my story, sometimes my story changes. And sometimes the timelines change a little bit. And I think that that's okay. So I'm going to go back to this woman, and I don't quite know when that happened. And that's why I'm being a little hesitant here. It's like, I don't know that this timeline quite lines up.
Okay.
But they seem very strongly connected to me. So it seems like this is the appropriate thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this experience with this woman, said, no more, I don't want to see this stuff anymore. And then relatively shortly afterward, I developed a pituitary tumor.
Mm-hmm.
And in life, in talking with other people, especially who have a spiritual / psychic lifestyle, I'll say, they said that those two things are probably connected.
Mm-hmm.
By shutting off whatever flow was going through you, perhaps that was going through your pituitary that caused a blockage, and that relates to why that tumor occurred there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk about that in greater detail later,
mm-hmm.
but it's almost as though doing things like remote viewing and having a structure to how to do it are basically a way to let that energy flow through me in a way that's, I'll say, more controlled and
mm-hmm.
basically keeping me healthy is how I view it.
Right. Okay, great.
Something I almost need to do in some way, shape, or form.
Right. An outlet, psychic outlet. Sure. You mentioned that this talent for finding lost objects. How far back do you remember being able to do that? Was there anything that precipitated that starting, or?
Great question. We didn't talk about this when we talked last time. It started when I was struck by lightning in 1989.
Okay.
And so I was, what my brother says is, Jeff, we were not struck by lightning. When you're struck by lightning, you die. We just happened to be near lightning strikes. So my brother's actually been struck 3 times, a lot more seriously than I. I was literally holding an umbrella. Lightning hit a light pole that I was walking next to. But when it happened, I threw the umbrella, sparks were coming out of my hand, and all my hair was literally standing on end. Wow. It did something to me.
Okay.
It was an exhilarating experience that was perfect.
Exhilarating.
It didn't hurt me, but it seemed like it changed me in a positive way.
Oh, wow. So you felt fine afterwards, huh?
Yes.
And how old were you roughly?
Probably 20, 21.
Okay. And then you notice afterwards you started to, do you recall the first time that you employed the skill of finding a lost object? Like, how did that first happen?
No is my short answer.
Okay.
Interesting question again. I remember, I went to Purdue University, and Purdue was getting a lot of, this was 1989, they were getting a lot of high-powered computer equipment because they were an educational institution. And I remember a lot of very geeky people working on things at a computer basis. And as part of my homework, I would often go to a computer lab, and like the main, I'll say, computer, the mainframe for the university was next to this computer lab. Mm-hmm. And some people were talking in the background about how they had this very specific, important cable and nobody could find it. And I literally stood up, went into a room that was like, no admittance, don't go in here, went to the box where it was, picked it up and handed it to them. Mm-hmm. Like, I knew right where it was.
Just some kind of a knowing.
Yes.
Okay. So you had this ability. At some point you said, no, I don't want this. You had this experience with this newly married woman who you saw her husband having an affair, and you shut that off, and shortly thereafter you were diagnosed with a pituitary tumor. Now, I know from speaking with you that you started to use some visualization methods to address this on your own, along with whatever contemporary treatment you were using. Let's take a step back, because a lot of what you did to treat yourself with your pituitary tumor connects with the story of your uncle, who is, in some ways, was an inspiration for you getting involved in confectionery. Is that right?
That's true.
So let's talk a little bit about your uncle.
So my Uncle George was a very type A personality. I can do anything. I can rule the world. He was just he was CEO of companies, very much a leader. And I grew up with stories of him. And I grew up with stories of him maybe a little bit later in life. And one of the stories was about his health, which made a dramatic change in his life. And he would, okay, this is another thing where the truth changes. So this is my version of the truth. I've asked several family members, is this how you remember the story? And nobody remembers this part of it. But okay. I remember it so clearly. It's like crystal clear. So in 1979, 3 Mile Island had its nuclear accident. And my Uncle George would start by saying, he would start his story, at least in my memory of the occurrence was, I was in Middletown, Pennsylvania, just across the street from 3 Mile Island when it had its little nuclear release. And 8 years later, I developed these 2 rare types of cancer, but those 2 things were not related at all. The cancer was a gift that I needed to change, to have learning in my life. I was somebody who thought that I could do everything, and this was basically the opportunity for me to learn that it's okay to accept help from other people. So my Uncle George was diagnosed with 2 very rare types of cancer, and the treatment for one was contraindicated for the other. So they had actually, I believe, given him six weeks to live and said, we're not even sure what to do for you. Well, the treatment for one would probably feed the other. We don't know what to do. So he lived for another 12 years and outlived 3 of his oncologists. So he was somewhere early along in this process, he was given a book by someone named Dr. Bernie Siegel. And he wrote a book called Love, Medicine, and Miracles. And it was basically about how extraordinary patients overcame things in ways that weren't explainable and what these extraordinary patients had in common. And one of the common things that they had was they had some sort of visualization about their health. So it's very similar to the way that athletes will train and they'll visualize their sport and, okay, I'm going to jump here, I'm going to do this here. And they'll basically walk through a routine before they actually will do it. And they'll walk through it over and over, have this visualization. So people who had extraordinary healing experiences often had some sort of visualization regarding their health. So my Uncle George basically sat and said, okay, what sort of visualization would get this cancer out of my body? And he loved gummy bears. And one of his visualizations was to imagine Haribo gummy bears all along his skin at the outside of his body. And the little bears would fold over, stick their heads inside of his body. And anytime they would see a black cell go by, they'd grab it with their gummy hands and throw it out of his body. And he would do this daily. He would just basically sit with this meditation and throw the black cancer cells out of his body. And as time went on, he had a couple other visualizations. That's the one that I specifically remember first. And about 1.5 years had gone by. My Uncle George was still doing relatively well. He was getting chemotherapy. He was getting some conventional treatments. And at one point in time, he went in for chemo, and his white blood cell count was not just low, it was actually 0. He had no detectable white blood cells. And they said, okay, this is below a level at which we can give you chemo, but it's so low, you're actually at high risk for getting any sort of infection. You need to stay away from people. You need to stay away from anybody who might be sick in any way, shape, or form. This, I believe, was a Thursday. They sent him home and said, come back on Monday, and we'll see if your white blood cell count is high enough for us to give you chemo. And he went home and he said, okay, what sort of visualization would raise my white blood cell count? He was a very devout Catholic. And so a white blood cell to him was similar to a communion host. And so he imagined communion host going into his body at an astronomical rate. And he associated a sound with this too. He said it was like the sound of a automatic card shuffling deck.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like a dun, 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 dun. And so each time a communion host went in his body, there was a little sound. And he would just sit there for hours and imagine this happening over and over again, and his white blood cell count going up. So he went to the doctor on the next Monday, and not only was his white blood cell count in the acceptable range for the chemo, it was actually back to a normal range, which it hadn't been for months. And this is the point where his doctors, who in the past, when he would talk about visualization, it's like, yeah, sure, if that works, go ahead and keep doing it. Great, good for you. But when this event occurred, his doctor looked at him and said, George, can you teach this to other people? Mm-hmm. And this is when he started essentially trying to encourage people to do a similar thing to what he was doing. So I grew up with these stories. And when I was diagnosed, my first response was, okay, what sort of visualization do I need? And I had 3 that I went back to. The very first one that came to me was kind of interesting because it didn't really seem like it was doing anything, but it was very comforting. That would be the right word for it. So I would imagine the 7 dwarfs singing, hi ho, it's off to work we go. And one of the 7 dwarfs is Doc. Doc is in charge. So I had this little doctor who was going and walking up to my pituitary with 6 helpers, and they were doing whatever needed to be done. And I didn't need to know what that was. I did have a picture of one dwarf with a very old-time adding machine where you basically pull the handle and it adds things up. And in my mind, somehow so what the pituitary does is it is basically the regulator of all the hormones in your body. One of the symptoms that I was having at the time was my body couldn't control its body temperature. Mm-hmm. And I would have huge swings in body temperature. That was one of my weird symptoms at the time. And when I started doing this visualization, that part of the problem went away. And it was almost as though one of the 7 dwarfs was counting all the hormones that my pituitary made and making adjustments to correct for it. Mm-hmm. It was like I was adding a control system by doing this visualization. Crazy, yes. Do I believe that that's true? I don't know, but it worked for me, and if it works, I'm not going to argue with it.
Right. Do you think that the visualization that your uncle did with the communion host going into him at a astronomical rate, and the sound that he added with it of a card shuffler, I noticed there was some sound in that first visualization that you shared. Do you think making these types of visualizations multi-sensory makes them more effective?
I do. I think it makes them stronger. Absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned that the oncologists that were treating your uncle when he came in and had raised his white blood cell count to an unprecedented level, they wanted him to teach what he was doing to others. Do you know if he had any success with teaching other people and those patients having some success?
So that's a very good question again. It actually made him rather depressed.
Oh. Because
he very quickly learned that a lot of people who had cancer did not want to get well.
Oh, okay.
For whatever reason. That they had, especially back in the 1970s, a diagnosis of cancer was sort of viewed as a death sentence. Mm-hmm. And people, once diagnosed, basically took that on as part of their identity, and it was like there was no opportunity to change it.
Wow.
And one of the things Dr. Bernard Siegel talked about was he basically grouped people into 3 different categories. And he could describe what category they were in by asking them a question. And the question was, do you want to live to be 100 years old? And when he asked patients that question, 30% would say, no. I know what my grandparents were like when they were getting older. I don't want to go through that. I don't want to, that's just a terrible time in life. I don't want to approach life that way. No, I don't want to live to be 100 years old. Mm-hmm. Then there'd be about 65% who would say, well, if I'm healthy, if I have a good support system, if all the planets line up and I'm fully functioning, yeah, okay, I can live to be 100. So they want to live to be 100 with stipulations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only about 5% of the population who will just give an unequivocal yes. Yes, I want to live to be 100 years old. Yes, I want to survive for as long as I can. And those are the people that tend to have spontaneous healing and do better with ongoing diseases or severe diseases. And if you actually read Bernie Siegel's work, he has a more recent book, The Art of Healing. So that's actually the book that I often give away to people these days. That those numbers have changed a little bit. And it's probably more like 25, 55, 10. Okay. And people are getting almost a little bit more optimistic about their health as the decades go on.
Did Bernie describe any cases where someone who said they did not want to live to be 100, they could change how they viewed that with some kind of introspective work of some type?
I'm definitely not an expert in his work, but I know one of the things that he definitely encourages people to do is to draw self-portraits, essentially. And not to draw just one, but to draw 2 self-portraits of yourself. One is basically how you see yourself today, and then a second one of how you want to see yourself in the future. Mm-hmm. And it's almost, to a certain extent, creating that source of optimism, creating a bright, compelling future to work for. What would it be like if you didn't have this encumbrance? How would your life be different?
Mm-hmm. Sounds like there's almost a co-creation process there, because I can imagine someone doing that and maybe not easily putting that vision of their future self onto the paper, but the act of, needing to do so as part of the exercise might cause them to start thinking, well, what do I want that future self to look like? And that in itself could be transformative.
Absolutely.
Now, when you were diagnosed with this pituitary tumor, I know you were familiar a little bit with your uncle's story and about Bernie's Siegel. Is that his last name?
Yes, Bernie Siegel.
Had you read any of Bernie Siegel's work prior to your diagnosis?
I believe I had, yes. So when my uncle was asked to help others, he basically quickly encountered people that were, in a sense, depressed and made him depressed, people who didn't want to live. So his screening method became to literally hand people a book saying, Love, Medicine, and Miracles by Bernie Siegel, saying, read this, and if you're still interested, then I'll help you. So that became his screening mechanism for people who were actually positively motivated and wanted to change. Mm-hmm. And so I'm quite sure there were several copies of it around my house growing up, and I do believe I read it.
Right. And you probably picked it up again when you after your diagnosis, I'm imagining. So we're going to transition on to some of your journey with your pituitary tumor. Anything else we want to mention about your uncle before we move forward from that?
I think that's good for now. Yes.
And that visualization that he used of the gummy bears was one of the inspirations for your chosen career path.
I don't know. It made it a more obvious path to take when the opportunity arose. Yes.
Okay. All right.
And actually, this last week I was teaching a short course at the University of Wisconsin in advanced and enhanced gummy manufacture. So,
wow.
Yes, that's become a big part of my life.
Huh. Yeah, I'm guessing you probably don't tell that story at your engineering conferences or lectures.
So it's not a common occurrence, but I have told it to numerous people that I work with. I also have talked about having my own YouTube channel where I basically tell this story. And I started out with a list of 10 lessons learned that were going to be individual YouTube videos. Mm-hmm. And I've never really done it, in part because it gets there are some that get really complex, and I don't think that we're going to even go into those today. So
okay,
I haven't done it because I haven't figured out how to tell the story.
right.
And I actually went to a writing workshop with the focus of how best to tell the story. And the leader of this writing workshop was fantastic. And she set me down a pathway that was rather dark, I'll say. And it was a great learning experience for me. But I don't think I want to share that with anybody, quite honestly. It had to do more with additional reasons why I might have gotten this pituitary tumor myself. Mm. And perhaps I'll tell the story someday, but I'm not ready to tell it yet.
Right.
They say time heals all wounds. So time definitely plays a role in healing. And there's many different levels to that as well.
Okay. Well, look forward to your YouTube channel at some point, whenever that comes into fruition, whenever it's time. So you shared one of your visualizations that you started doing of the seven, was it the seven dwarfs?
Yes.
And you noticed a fairly a quick improvement on your ability to regulate your body temperature. Do you want to share any of the other visualizations you started to employ?
So I had 3 that were my go-to visualizations. So the seven dwarfs. A second one came from, so in addition to typical Western medicine, I was doing some other healing modalities at this time, including I had an acupuncturist who was fantastic. And basically the Chinese medicine description of what a tumor is it's essentially tissue exposed to too much heat, and it cooks and solidifies in an unnatural way. So the Chinese explanation of a tumor is too much heat in the body. And so it was actually my acupuncturist who suggested the visualization of laying in a stream and having water of just the right temperature, whatever that temperature was that particular day, to run over my body and take the excess heat out. And it even run through my body. So I actually imagine water going through my body, across my pituitary, and out, taking away excess heat.
Yeah, it sounds like a good one. Yes. Did you notice anything specific with that one, as far as results or how you felt afterwards?
It was always kind of peaceful and like a reset switch. Mm-hmm. It was a very pleasant thing to do. Mm-hmm. Did I notice any true clinical changes from it? I can't say that I would attribute them, but it was definitely a comforting thing to do. Mm-hmm.
And what was your diagnosis with this pituitary tumor? It was a slow growing kind of thing, right?
So I was actually diagnosed with an MRI, which showed a tumor about the size, a little bit smaller than a ping pong ball inside so the pituitary is between both lobes of your brain. It's not actually within your brain. Mm. And so I had a relatively large tumor. And in my case, most of the effects that I was having were the pressure that large tumor was pressing against my pituitary itself and the surrounding tissues. Mm. And so I was basically diagnosed with this by an MRI. I was actually seeing 2 different competing, I'll say, endocrinologists at the time. And both basically read from the same book when I got my diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay, you have a pituitary tumor. Most of the times they're completely asymptomatic. In your case, in this case, that's not the case. You're having symptoms because of this pituitary tumor. We have this drug that we're going to put you on. We honestly do not know how it works, but in almost all cases, this works to alleviate symptoms. And you'll be on this drug the rest of your life. It has very minimal side effects, and you should live a long, prosperous life. This is no way is going to limit your lifespan. Don't think of this as being something negative for the rest of your health. You'll be on this drug, and it will take care of everything. And there's always exceptions. So most pituitary tumors are slow growing. Sometimes they're a fast growing variety. So after 4 months, they wanted me to get a follow-up MRI just to be sure I didn't have one of the fast growing types. Mm-hmm. So I got put on this medication, and literally my symptoms went away right away. So I had a headache every day from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. You could set a watch by it.
Oh, wow.
It was very time dependent and very recurring. And it was just this debilitating headache. Couldn't really do much for that hour, but then it would go away and I'd be okay. And once I started taking the drug, that never happened again.
Oh, okay.
And then there were just a lot of other things. There was almost a calming that came over me. It was like my body wasn't in a fight anymore. It was literally life-changing. It just was a great experience.
Wonderful.
But I still kept going to my acupuncturist. I still kept doing the non-traditional things.
Okay.
And so at 3 months, my insurance company switched me from the brand name of the drug. Oh, actually, let's go back one more thing. Along with the diagnosis, you'll live a long, healthy life. But if you ever have the worst headache of your life and it just doesn't go away, you probably need to get to an emergency room right away. Because if you have a really bad headache, the tumor has probably hemorrhaged and you need immediate surgery to rectify that. And then it's actually even good now if you set up a relationship with a neurosurgeon so that you have somebody to go to if this were to ever happen. So that's the diagnosis I walked out with. And then at 3 months, I had switched from the brand name to the generic medication. And the weekend that was going through, I had a little bit of a headache. Not the worst of my life by any means. So let's just set that aside for now, and let's go back to my acupuncturist office 3 months after my diagnosis. So, go ahead.
Yes, you were doing the water washing over you visualizations.
Yes.
And I think there was at least one other one that you had been utilizing that maybe wasn't very effective up until that point.
Yes, I was going to my acupuncturist about once a week, and it would essentially be an hour of laying on a massage table with needles in me at different points. And this would be one of my main visualization times. Okay. And so this one day I decided to go back to a visualization that I thought would be very helpful, but never seemed to get anywhere. And so I imagined a straw coming through the top of my head and connecting with my pituitary, and that straw went out to the vacuum of space. And that the vacuum of space was going to suck the pituitary tumor out and get it out of my body. And I would visualize this setup and nothing would happen. Not all that surprising in a real world, but in the cartoon world, it made sense. It was like, I always have this visualization of my life being like Roadrunner Coyote movies and being able to control things in ways that don't happen in the real world, but are good in the cartoon world. So in the cartoon world, sucking it out to the vacuum of space made sense.
Right.
But it never quite worked. But here I am laying on this table with needles in me. I can't really move. And I start doing this visualization, and literally this little man walks into the room. And this little man says, "Jeff, you have a tumor that was caused by the excess heat in your head, and I can show you how to use that excess heat to get rid of the tumor. Would you like me to show you how?" And I said, "Sure." So this little man, cartoon-like this is at this point. This isn't like he was really in the room. This is very cartoon-like. He puts his hands inside of my head, and like you're starting a fire by rubbing a stick and getting the friction going really fast, he rubs his hands together very fast and essentially sets my tumor on fire. And the straw is still there as part of the visualization, but it's much shorter and it's coming out into the room, and I can see smoke coming out of the straw. And as this whole visualization develops, I can literally start to smell burning flesh in the room. It's like burning hair, but 10 times stronger.
Wow.
So he's like doing this. I see the smoke. I smell the smell. It's like I'm you have a flight or freeze response. I'm just completely frozen. I can't move, in part because of the needles in my head, and in part because this little man has his hands inside my head. So it's like I'm surrendering to whatever he's doing. Let's see where this goes.
Yeah.
So after 2 or 3 minutes, he stops and says, "Okay, I've gotten rid of your tumor." And I'll say there's a knowing where, at least along the storyline, it's like, yeah, I feel that he got rid of my tumor. It is no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say to him, "Thank you." Those are my first words. Then, "How can I thank you?" There's no response from him. And I said, "At least tell me your name." And he says, I could tell you my name, but you probably won't remember it. But I'll tell you in a way that you might be able to remember it." And then it's like he is gone at this point. Then I see the complete visualization change, and it's like Wheel of Fortune. And there's a whole bunch of letters in front of me. And the letters the first time are, "I am hope." And then the letters bounce around and change a little bit, and it's "Hope I am." They change another time, and it's "Hopi I am," as in like he's a Hopi Indian. That was my thought. And then they bounce around and change one more time, and it's "Nopium." So Nopium is my guess as to what his name was. Now, he told me that I might not be able to remember, that I probably wouldn't be able to remember. So is that completely accurate? I don't know, but that's what I'm going with.
Nopium.
Yes.
Now, when you were having this conversation with this little man and asking him his name, this is all internally, an internal conversation. You weren't actually speaking out loud in the room, or were you?
No, this was all, if you want to call it telepathic, that you could, but that doesn't even seem like the right word.
Right.
I don't know what to call it. It was an experience. And it felt real, but there was not... Actually, there was an auditory aspect to it. It was though I was hearing it, but it wasn't as though I was speaking. It was more like watching a movie.
Okay. And eventually the acupuncturist who was treating you came back in the room. I'm assuming you didn't mention anything about the little man that had come in.
I absolutely told him the whole story.
Oh, you did? Okay.
He is big into this sort of thing.
Oh, interesting.
So I told him the whole story, but outside of him, at this point in time, I think there was only one other person I told.
Okay.
It was just a weird experience that happened. That was interesting. Do I still have this tumor or not? I don't know.
Yeah.
So at 4 months, my doctors had set up a follow-up MRI to see if I had this fast-growing type of tumor.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, actually, timeline-wise, my acupuncturist appointment and the Nopium experience were on a Thursday. This headache over the weekend was a following weekend where I changed from brand name to generic of the medication I was on. So like Saturday, Sunday, and into Monday a little bit, I had this headache.
So a week after this experience with hopium.
A couple days after, actually.
Or nopium.
And then going out forward to 4 months, I have a follow-up MRI.
Okay.
And I remember I went to see Dr. Kerr, who's my favorite endocrinologist. And he comes in and he looks at me. I had also had blood work done at the same time I had the MRI. And he says, he basically says, "Jeff, this is an interesting case." So one thing I've learned over the years, when doctors say your case is interesting, that basically means they have no idea what's going on. Interesting is like a keyword with doctors. Mm-hmm. Interesting means we don't know what to do here. So I've had several other occasions where I've had interesting cases. That's a keyword with doctors, and I embrace it. So I like to be interesting. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Kerr says, "So Jeff, your MRI shows that your pituitary has hemorrhaged. It has essentially destroyed itself." There was a remnant of it that was filled with actually fluid. It was on the MRI, you can distinguish between blood and other fluids. And there was a remnant of a little sac of tissue that was filled with blood. And at that point in time, he said that will probably go away in time, and it actually did. So that did occur. But he says, Jeff, when pituitary tumors hemorrhage, this is the part of the things that they don't tell you when they diagnose you. When a pituitary tumor hemorrhages, 50% of the time people die. That's a non-survivable event. It's essentially a big stroke is what it is. It's a massive blood loss in your head. Mm-hmm. 49% of the time, your hormones are so screwed up that you're going to be on 30 or 40 medications trying to get them back in balance. Mm. And then there's the 1% that they call free brain surgery. And I had free brain surgery. So my pituitary tumor essentially destroyed itself, and my hormone levels were back to essentially normal.
Wow.
Yeah.
So at that point, you're thinking, thank you, Nopium.
Yes. So Dr. Kerr was also somebody I told about the story, and he just smiled and nodded his head. But I told him the story because he actually spent a lot of time in China, and while he didn't practice Chinese medicine, he definitely knew the ins and outs of it. Mm-hmm. And he had this beautiful picture on his wall of this kind of sparkly red and jade depiction. It was beautiful. So it was almost like this. He was a very Western doctor. He was actually 73 years old at that point in time. He was very old for a doctor, but still practicing because that's what he loved to do. And everything was very clinical in his office, except for this beautiful red and green painting. And it's like, okay, that's how I know I can tell him the story.
Right. Yeah, there's something there. Interesting. So the story with Nopium does not end there, though.
No, it does not. So I told a few more people my story at this point in time that I thought might believe me, but I didn't want to seem like I was completely crazy. So most of my family members didn't know about it at this point in time, and especially not my mother. And my mother at this time, actually, she had colon cancer several years before. And we joked that she had colon cancer for 17 days because she was diagnosed with it, had surgery, had it removed. They caught it early. She never had any follow-up treatment of any way, shape, or form. But then later on, she developed liver cancer. And they had determined that it was probably the colon cancer that had metastasized to her liver, but just hadn't shown up until a few years later. Mm-hmm. And so she was on an experimental drug, a gene therapy, that dramatically reduced the size of her tumor. But in all the experimentation that they'd done with it, the gene therapy they didn't believe that it would get rid of the tumor completely. It only reduced the size. So after it reduced the size substantially, they basically went in and removed about 1/3 of her liver, which is something you can survive without. Mm-hmm. So they removed the cancerous area and a large border around it, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so I was with my mom when she woke up from her surgery. And it had been a long surgery. It took much longer than anticipated, and we never quite knew why. It was very late at night when I was with her back in her recovery room, and when she woke up. And I was the only one in the room at the time. And my mother, literally sits up with the start and is extremely conscious and is definitely there right away. Much more so than she should have been after such long anesthesia. Mm-hmm. And she looks at me, and she looks next to me, and she says, Jeff, who's that little man next to you? And then at this point, that burst of energy starts to fade away a little bit, and you can tell that she's actually going back to sleep. And she says, who's that little man next to you? And then just as she falls back asleep, she says, in her words, I've never said this to her, she says, Nopium. And then goes back to sleep.
Wow. You must have had chills going up and down your
body.
I
have chills right now. Okay, so there's that's probably the chilliest part of the story, but I'm not done yet.
Yeah, you're not done yet. Did she recall any of that once she
no, she did not.
Okay.
Which I wonder about that, actually. I'm quite sure it happened.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You say it's atypical that someone would wake up with that level of alertness after a surgery. I wonder if this nopium wanted you to, was involved in her waking up, almost like, hey, this I'm still here. This was real, and keep exploring, keep looking into this. No way to know, but that's interesting.
Interesting question, yes.
So So what happened after that with nopium? Your exploration.
So nopium is an odd name, and I started asking anybody that might have any connection to that sort of name. I went down India Hindu path. That's what it sort of sounded like to me as a name, and got no response whatsoever. Googling it, asking a wide variety of people who do, I'll say, esoteric things. It's like, nope, that doesn't ring a bell at all. But one of the things in the letters moving was Hopi I am. So it took me a couple of years to get out to Arizona to the Hopi reservation, but I did make it there. And I was there for 3 days. And everybody that I met, whether they were a waiter in a restaurant, the person at the inn that we were staying at, just across the board, I told everybody my story. And I was somewhat shocked at how universal the response was. It was very much a, yeah, cold shoulder, yeah, whatever. It was like, here's another white person coming to steal our medicine. We've had enough of this. Yeah, when you can't leave soon enough. That was kind of the feel that I got from everybody that I told the story to.
And you're earnestly sharing the story because you're trying to connect the dots here for yourself and try to just, okay.
So 3 days at the Hopi reservation, a little bit disappointed. I am opening the door to the rental car, getting ready to leave. And up walks next to me this little woman who is extremely short-statured, a little bit like nopium. And she says, "Hello, my name is Mary. I am one of the historians of our tribe, and we wanted to let you know that we have heard your story. And our tribe, at about the year 800, had 2 medicine men that were twins. And they would provide healing to people of the day. And they continue to provide healing dreams to people this day, up until today. And we've always known them as the twins. If a Hopi person has a healing dream, they will both be there in the dream. But if a non-Hopi person is visited by them and has a healing dream, it will usually just be one of the twins. And we've never known what their true names were. We've only known them as the twins. And we think that you perhaps have told us the name of one of the twins." And she said, "Thank you." And my response was, "Okay, so what do I do with this information?" And her response was, "Well, continue to give thanks. Thank nopium every day for what he's done for you." And basically that was the extent of it. But I felt justified, but at the same time, this gets into one of my learnings from this whole experience. And that's having soft beliefs about everything. So if I had very stringent beliefs, I probably wouldn't have had acceptance of this whole story. But if I had a really strong belief in this whole story, I don't know what quite that would make me as a person. I think that would make me a little bit, I don't even know what the right words were, but that doesn't seem like it would be healthy either. So my approach at just about everything in life has been, well, this is a very complicated world. We have our own model of the world, and people's models of the world are different. Never have the expectation that you're going to know the true truth about everything. It's just okay to have soft beliefs about everything, have them be malleable, have them flexible enough to change, and know maybe you were visited by nopium, maybe it's a story that you created. Either one is great, but just be thankful for either one. Whatever your beliefs are, as long as you get a positive response out of it, that works for you.
Yeah, I really like that. It's if, does the belief serve you? If it serves you, then great. Doesn't necessarily have to be true or not true. Soft belief. That's a great term. Did you come up with that term, or is that?
I think so.
Yeah. As a YouTube video right there. Yeah,
Yes,
I like that. So, any experiences with Nopium after that, or is that the last one, at least at this point?
So that is the last one that has any level of, I'll say, I'm going to use the word proof. Not that any of this is really a proof of anything. So I have asked Nopium to help other people from time to time.
Oh, really?
Any proof that there was any sort of activity or existence or help given? No, I would say. But I have asked. So I thank him, and I also ask him to help other people from time to time.
Wow, that's a fascinating story. So, and I take it your pituitary tumor, everything is still doing well with that in terms of your recovery?
So yeah, I would say yes. So I just had a follow-up MRI one more time. So doctors like me to have one every year. Mm-hmm. And after a while I said, let's do this every other year, because it just, when I have MRIs, they do it with contrast. So they're actually injecting a little bit of a metal into your bloodstream to contrast the tissues more. And that probably isn't the healthiest thing for you. So I like to try and avoid that as much as I can. So I had pushed it to every 2 years, and they were sort of okay with that. And after my last one, so that little pocket of blood that was left, after about 3 years, there was still a clear fluid in it, but it was no longer blood. It never showed up. It no longer showed up as blood on an MRI. And then it gradually got smaller and smaller and smaller. So with my last MRI, I didn't ask. I told my endocrinologist, okay, we're going to push this back to every 5 years now. So yes, I'll still do it. I'll still have follow-ups, but less and less will be fine. I'm okay.
Yeah, wonderful. So we talked a little bit more when we met, and you have a few other stories that seem to be connected with this running thread of sort of exploring the, I don't know what you want to call it, the unseen world or paranormal phenomena or sixth sense type of stuff. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about on the podcast? You mentioned several what you refer to as near-death-like experiences, and including one that seemed to be a near-death experience or near-death experience, actually down the road from where I live, near a place where you used to work as a confectionery engineer, if I'm recalling that correctly. Is that right?
So sure, I will gladly tell that story in essence, because it's a little bit different than the perspective that most people put on near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. And I think it has a level of truth to it that's really interesting. It's definitely a subject that fascinates me. Mm-hmm. And actually, what almost fascinates me more is what I'll call near-birth experiences. Mm. So if we are being reincarnated in some way, shape, or form, how do we leave and how do we come back? So I'm interested at both ends of that cycle, and they're curiosities of mine. But my little piece to add to this puzzle involved a car accident that I avoided. Mm-hmm. So I had actually worked in Hershey, Pennsylvania for 10 years. And this occurred just after I had switched jobs, and I was going back to Hershey, and American Airlines put the luggage for the plane that I flew in on the wrong plane. So nobody on the plane had their luggage. And so there was a long line at the airport. It took a while to process everybody. I rented a car. I went to the hotel I was staying at. And then I knew the area pretty well. And I knew that there was a Walmart that was open 24 hours, not too far away. So I said, I'm going to at least go drive to Walmart and get a toothbrush, toothpaste, that sort of stuff. And so I said, I head out down the road. It is just about midnight, and it's a 4-lane divided highway, and I am in the right-hand lane, and I'm going to be turning right in about 1.5 miles. And I'm driving the car. I'm looking down at my hands, and it's as though somebody else is controlling my hands. I see one hand come off of the steering wheel, turn on the blinker, turn on my left blinker, put the hands back on the wheel, go over into the left lane, and then I'm driving in the left lane when I'm going to be turning in 1.5 miles to the right. This made no sense whatsoever. Just after I do this, there's like a whoosh that I sort of halfway experience. It happened so fast, I didn't even really know what it was. Mm-hmm. And I go ahead, I go on, and now in control of the car again, controlling my hands. I turn the blinker on, turn right into Walmart, go get a few things. Then I'm back out on the same road coming in the opposite direction. And there's a little hill that you go over, and I get over the crest of the little hill, and there are 30, 40 emergency vehicles there, flashing red lights everywhere. And I start to slow down, and I actually stop the car on the median. And I get out of the car, and I see, the first thing I see is the accident that occurred. And there is a pickup truck that literally is about 2 feet long.
Wow.
So a drunk driver without its lights on was traveling down the road in the wrong direction. And presumably I turned and avoided lanes, or somebody moved my car to the other lane. Mm-hmm. And this drunk driver whizzed past me and then hit the car behind me. Mm. So I, at this point, realize what has happened, and I could not breathe. I literally fall down to the ground. I'm not able to breathe watching all this. It's as though I am dying to a certain extent. And then all of a sudden I start gasping. I realize, hey, I was supposed to die there, but I didn't. And I start breathing again. So I've had this period without oxygen for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And whether that caused this visualization, whatever caused this visualization, I don't know. But it's as though I see 2 men looking up over this accident scene, laughing hysterically. And I have names for them. I know one is Pete. I can't remember the other one's name right now. It's like I knew their names. And it's like lifetime after lifetime, they do this to each other. They kill themselves. They kill the other one in unexpected ways. And it's like they have this ongoing cosmic joke. Yeah, this whole life thing, that's so funny, ha, ha, ha. That there's so much more to this than this little life that we have down here. Mm-hmm. I don't know what this means. I don't know, is that true? I don't know where that would have come from if that wasn't true, if that isn't what really happened. Mm-hmm. But it seems like such an important part of this afterlife story. And what does all this life mean? What are we here doing? It seems like we're here for some sort of a learning experiment, and that we're recycling through here oftentimes. That's my current soft belief, and that might change over time. We'll see.
Did you ever, you said you know that one of the names was Pete. Did you ever look up the accident report after the fact and find out the names of the deceased?
Yeah. So I looked up the accident report and no names were listed.
Interesting.
It's like I'm not supposed to have the answer to that question. Stop looking, Jeff. That was how I interpreted that.
Soft beliefs, Jeff. That's quite an experience. And I know almost exactly where you're talking about, because I used to live in Hershey as well. You mentioned right prior to that story that you're interested in both near death and, did you say near birth or experiences?
That's what I said. I don't know that there's a great term for it.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm not quite sure what that part of what you're interested in is about.
Okay, so I'm going to turn that around to a question to you. When is your earliest memory?
That's a good question. I have fairly early memory of a dream, and I think I have a fairly early memory of maybe when I'm 2 or 3. But I'd say this dream. I'd say the dream is probably my earliest memory, a recurring dream that I used to have.
Okay, so my earliest memory occurred before I was born. Before I was born.
Okay.
I have this incredible memory of being in my parents' bedroom and listening to my father, who, when I was born, was 49 years old, and listening to my father talk to my mother about how he's too old to be a father. How is he going to be there for me, for this child? So I have a pre-birth memory that is so, I'll say, accurate, and there are parts of their bedroom that I could come through so clear in this visualization, but that I wasn't even solid yet. It was like I was an entity in their room, but also in my mother's womb at the same time. Huh. So I have a visualization from outside of my mother of their bedroom at this point in time, and them having this conversation.
So when was the first time you recalled having this visualization? Like, do you?
Great. So I think at about, I remember talking to somebody about this in second grade.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when you're in second grade, I think you're still holding on to probably more things that you lose belief in as you grow older. Mm-hmm. And it was as though it was a common, in talking to a second grader, it was as though that was a common conversation to have. It didn't seem odd at the time.
Right.
So there's one thing that I just keep going back to. In near-death experiences, there's often a tunnel that people travel through. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions I always ask people is, what shape is that tunnel? Because I have this, I'll say it's a memory. Is it a dream that predates listening to my father when I was in the womb? That it's almost a memory I have of before being conceived and coming through a tunnel. But the tunnel has a particular shape to it. And I'll say it's a triangular shaped tunnel. It is not round. And I've never heard anybody else describe it this way. There are some people who talk about this sort of thing in hypnotic regressions and things like that. And I've never heard anybody talk about a triangular tunnel, but I'm like, that's my soft belief. I think we come here in a triangular tunnel in some way, shape, or form. And why that would have any significance, I don't know, but it seems like that's the one thing I'm grasping onto of that before conception life. I don't know.
Yeah, I've never heard of the triangular tunnel too. Maybe it means you're some type of an alien soul or something like that. Maybe I have a triangular tunnel too. I just don't recall it. Have you spoke personally? I there's probably some similar stories in literature involving, between life phenomena. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but have you ever personally talked to anyone who has similar pre-birth memories, kind of compared notes?
So a little bit, but so the few people that I've met that have had pre-birth, that I've met in person, it's always very spotty. It's always like, and they're always, I'm not even sure if this is real or not, but this seems to be what I remember. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fogginess and haze around those sorts of memories, which somewhat makes sense because they're so long ago, and what would actually be doing the remembering is an interesting part of that question. Right. If you weren't there, who's remembering? Mm-hmm.
Reminds me of some of the Dolores Cannon work. I don't know if you've looked into it, but I've always been interested in taking some of her training to, for those listeners who don't know what we're talking about, it's involves hypnotherapy, and Dolores actually ends up talking to, if I'm correct, the sort of spiritual guides that are involved in the client's life who has come to see Dolores. And not only get past life information, but they can actually interact with the spiritual guides or intelligences and get other information about the client's life and information in general. So it would be interesting to explore hypnotherapy to see if, like for myself, I don't have any of these pre-birth memories, but be interesting to see if through some type of hypnotherapy, if maybe they're there, but like you said, I'm old enough where I've lost memory of them now that that I'm an adult. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something there.
So I have long considered going and having a hypnotic regression, looking at that. Mm-hmm. But there's something that's stopping me. And what's stopping me is there's a similarity between all of these stories that you get after hypnotic regression and of pre-birth events. And part of me wonders, is that just become kind of like a folklore common story that everybody grabs onto? Is that real? Is my question. And I've decided I don't want to have a hypnotic regression by somebody who has ever done that sort of hypnotic regression before. If I were to do it, it would have to be with a hypnotherapist who has never done that before and that wouldn't have preconceived notions.
Yeah, that's smart. I like that. I don't know how you would vet that, because even in the
yes. Now you know why I haven't done it. Yes.
Yeah. That's good thinking, though. So I want to circle back to these visualizations and just speak more in general. If someone's listening to this and they're going through a health crisis of some type, or having an issue, and they want to try to apply what you and your uncle did with your issues, and as discussed in Bernie's work, do you have any specific guidance for them as to how to get started, or perhaps tips along the way that you've learned? I'm assuming reading Bernie's book would be one of them, but
so I would recommend what I think is his most recent book, called The Art of Healing. So let me explain why, actually. Mm-hmm. So Love, Medicine, and Miracles was his sort of landmark work. And people either love it or hate it, and most people hate it. Because one of the questions he asks is, I'm not sure how he was phrasing it at the time. How he phrases it now is, what purpose does this disease serve me? So in my case, what purpose does getting a pituitary tumor serve me? Mm-hmm. Well, it related to maybe perhaps blocking of psychic energies, wherever you want to go with that. Mm-hmm. So basically he would ask, what purpose does cancer serve you? That is a very offensive question to some people. It's like, how could I possibly you're basically suggesting that I'm trying to kill myself, is how people interpreted that question. And it was viewed by some as being a very negative question. And so he's sort of soft. I don't remember the exact language he used back in the early 80s, but he's sort of has taken that feedback and sort of softened his approach a little bit. It was perceived as a little bit harsh when he first started. So that question is still related in his current book, The Art of Healing, in a way. But what it focuses more on is basically developing a relationship. The way I view it is developing a relationship between your conscious and your subconscious. Your subconscious knows a lot of things that your conscious maybe doesn't want to hear or has a hard time understanding. And so one of the ways that's suggested to do that is through art. And as I said, drawing pictures of yourself, how you feel today, how you want to feel in the future. And there was a period of time where I was doing that daily and coming up with different variations on that.
Okay.
Also, if you have other people analyze those pictures with that in mind, they're going to see things that you can't see yourself. Your subconscious is going to put things onto paper that your conscious doesn't want to see, but it will be blatantly obvious to other people. So do these sort of self-portraits and share them with the people you love, share them with the people around you, and get their feedback and be open to their feedback.
Is that where the art of healing, is that part of where the book title comes from, as he talks about this art process?
Yes.
And of course, you have paintings on your wall, which if you're listening to the audio, you can't see, but Jeff has at least 4 paintings behind him, which I understand from speaking with you previously, Jeff, that these were a part of this process at some level.
So, yes. So for everybody who's watching, there's some there that look very, is it Andrew Pollock-like? They're kind of like spattering paint on a canvas, but there's a very different appearance to the current and the future. There's almost a structure to the future, as where the current, when I was ill, when I was sick, is very chaotic, extremely chaotic, and almost messy. But it takes sort of more of a structure and a painting within the lines approach. That's even not the right word. It has more of a clarity. It has more of a almost simpleness to it in how I wanted it to look in the future. That was in one particular segment. A lot more of my pictures looked very more humanoid. They were much more, and I was a very poor drawer. I was very poor at drawing things, and my initial paintings in doing this were very much stick figures with different colors associated with the stick figures. And it was very simple. That's how I started. You don't have to be good at art in order to do this and to have it be meaningful. But doing this, having this becoming a daily practice and taking just 10 minutes to do this every day with some Crayola markers, it was something to do that you could do for yourself. And when you have a serious illness, there aren't a whole lot of things that you can be in control of. And as crazy as it sounds, drawing a picture of yourself is something you can take control of. And there's a comfort that comes with that, even if nothing else.
Right. And it's the idea that in that process of drawing, these are opportunities for information from your subconscious to come onto the page, break into the light of day for your consciousness to see, or perhaps someone else you show the drawing to that could give you some feedback that might give you an aha kind of a feeling, or is just the process itself of bringing these pieces from the unconscious to the conscious, is that in and of itself healing, or how does this actually result in healing by bringing these pieces to light? Do you have realizations, or
I think that there are bits of learning that occur along the way.
Okay.
Okay, here's another thing that's on my list of things that would be a YouTube video that I have a very hard time putting into proper words. And I'm going to use training for the Olympics as an example. So a person might train for the Olympics years and years and years, running, controlling their diet, and then they finally get to the Olympics and do their 100-yard dash, and it's over in a matter of seconds. To a certain extent, healing occurs the same way. Healing occurs in an instant. You go from being well to being sick in an instant. You go from being sick to being well in an instant. But to make that transition, you might have to do a lot of practicing. You might have to do a lot of drawing. You might have to do a lot of work in order for that one instant to occur.
I can see that, how that could apply in your life. I mean, you were doing visualizations of several different types. You were, of course, doing your contemporary treatment and your acupuncture. But then it does seem with that visit by nopium that it did sort of, that tumor disappeared in an instant, as far as we know.
And know that can happen anytime is one of my beliefs anyway. But that's a little bit stronger than a soft belief. So even somebody who's far along in a debilitating process, that all can change in an instant. And there are stories of it happening. If it can happen to one person, it can happen to you too.
Right. It doesn't really feel like a hard belief. It kind of feels like keeping the door open, which is kind of like another way of describing what a soft belief is too. Door's not closed. Doors, you're not at the door insisting that things come in, but the door is open, and there's possibilities and hope, which is important in the healing process, I would think. So we'll probably go ahead and start drawing the interview to a close. Jeff, before I do, is there anything else that you wanted to add for our particular conversation today that we've missed?
I think I'm good.
One thing I do want to... Go ahead.
I almost feel like I want to do this whole thing one more time. Because I know that there are parts I missed that I'm not aware of right now. I'm sure when I go back and listen to this, I'm like, I want to add this here. I want to add this here. So maybe we'll do this again in the future. Who knows?
Yeah, I love talking with you. And if you ever want to come back, you're more than welcome to. We can definitely do a part 2. It wouldn't be the first time I had a multi-part conversation. So by all means, just let me know. Before I let you go, I'm looking at your paintings on your wall because we're doing this on video as well as audio. And there are a couple of things on those 2 paintings that almost look like pipes. I just was curious what those are.
I cannot explain to you why I put them there.
Okay.
But I'm sure they're supposed to be there.
What are they actually?
Okay, so I have a very strong Polish heritage. Uh-huh. So all 4 of my grandparents came from what would now be called Poland. It actually wasn't Poland yet at the time.
Uh-huh.
And there were this series of dolls that were basically people in, I'll say, historic Polish dress, doing historic Polish dances. There were this series of dolls that my grandparents had acquired at certain points in time. And nobody knows quite where those dolls are, but those were 2 canes that 2 of the dolls had.
Huh, interesting.
And so so these dolls were like probably 2.5 feet tall. So they were little people. They were little men. Oh. And so is that a little man's cane? I don't quite know. But I'm like, there's some sort of connection there where I want those to be together.
And you felt drawn to put them there.
Yes.
And of course, the Hopi historian that you spoke to said that they were twins, which is
yes.
the interesting. Yet for here, I almost wondered if some Native American cultures, they have certain types of pipes that are used in certain circumstances. And
so those are little wooden canes, actually.
Wooden canes.
But yes, I can see why you would think that.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked about that. That's very interesting.
So it's also interesting to go into all the folklore about of the little people in Native American history.
Oh, really?
So the Cherokee have described it best. There's probably the most actually written about the Cherokee little people, but they're basically little people that come and heal you, and the little people that live in your body like little dwarfs. So it's something that's characteristic of most Native American tribes. I think the Cherokee just have described it the best, but it's another thing that seems to be tied in with this whole story somehow.
Interesting. I think I read a book about or by a Native American medicine man named Black Elk. I don't remember what tribe he was in, and I think star people or something that I've heard discussed before in connection with some Native American cultures, but not necessarily little people or little men. Do you have, is there any particular book that if someone wants to read, look into that you'd recommend, that you've gotten some information?
There is a book that is in existence called The Cherokee Little People.
Okay.
And I have found a PDF of it. I have never found an actual hard copy of it.
Oh,
but it's actually a children's story about the little people that essentially, it's almost like a Santa Claus story to some extent. It's like if they're there to say, to punish you when you do bad and to reward you when you do good. But there's also a healing aspect to it too. It's interesting how that fits into their culture and how it draws similarities between other cultures.
Sounds like maybe there's a story within a story there too.
Yes.
Story for the children and a story for someone listening for a deeper message, perhaps. All right, Jeff. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast. You had a lot of interesting things to say, and I think a lot of practical. Someone could listen to this story and start down a practical path to perhaps working with a physical issue or maybe another issue that they might be working with. I'm definitely going to check out Bernie Siegel's book. I don't believe I've actually read any of his material, and see if I can take some wisdom from that as well. So thanks again, and I look forward to speaking with you sometime in the future.
All right. Have a great time. Thanks.